All right, let's look over the answers to the questions on page 336, and we'll attempt to talk about issues related to those things as we go. All right, number one, how did Lincoln's 10% plan differ from the Radicals' Wade-Davis bill concerning the number of white males taking the oath of allegiance? Jessica,
Lincoln proposed that 10%.
can you talk louder, please?
Lincoln proposed that 10% of 1860 election voters take oath of allegiance, whereas the Radicals' Wade-Davis bill required.
Wait, before you go on. In order to do what? Lincoln required 10% of those who voted in 1860 in a southern state, the 10% of those to give an oath of allegiance for what to happen?
I have that.
You have it later?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Tell us now, just make sure we keep this straight.
To figure out the and appointed officials in each state and federal government stuff.
Okay, this is a simpler way. I'm not sure if you got this or not. What was that requirement to accomplish? And
Set up a civilian government.
yeah, in other words, for the state to function as a state again, to be reconstructed, as they called it. So in order for a southern state to regain its status as a state, Lincoln proposed that 10% of those who voted in 1860 would have to give an oath of allegiance. Do you follow? Everybody follow that? Whether you had it as your answer or not, do everybody understand? Now, what do you think about that? 10% of those who voted in 1860. Does that sound like a good number, or would you have made it higher if you had been President of the United States? Michaela?
I would have made it higher, but I think that Lincoln had good intentions in making it up.
Okay, what were his intentions?
To help to make peace, and so people weren't in a war over it. So that way there wasn't really
Right, so Lincoln didn't want to prolong the process. He wanted to make it relatively easy so that the United States could get back to normalcy, right? And so that was his proposal, 10%. That's pretty minimal amount of people that would give an oath of allegiance who had voted. All right, so that's Lincoln's plan. All right, now so you need to have at least a plan there, even if you didn't have the full thing as to why. And then contrast with Wade-Davis bill. Go ahead, Jessica.
The Radicals' Wade-Davis bill required military governors for each southern state until a majority of adult white males, not just 10%, signed the oath of allegiance. It also demanded new provisions for the state constitutions.
Right, and the primary part of that in relationship to Lincoln is that they were requiring 50% of all white males to sign the oath. Whether they voted in 1860 or not didn't matter. They're looking at all white males and had to be over 50%. Stephen?
I just worded it like this. I said, I'm talking about Wade Davis, the first one. It said, it required military governors for each southern state until a majority of all adult white males, comma, rather than just 10% of voters, talking about Lincoln's, comma, had signed an oath of allegiance for the state to be reconstructed.
Did you just say all white males?
No.
I thought you said all adult white males.
Oh, I said, oh yeah, I did, but I said the majority of all.
Oh, majority.
The majority of all adult white males.
Oh, you said majority. Okay. I didn't remember whether you had said that or not by the time we got to the end of it. Okay. Yeah. That's again. There's other parts of the Wade-Davis bill, but the important part in comparing it to the questions is simply asking the number of white males taking the oath of allegiance. So that's all you had to deal with there. You had the military governor, all that stuff was part of it as well. But the main thing we're looking at here is simply the percentage of those that needed to have an oath of allegiance in order for the state to be considered a state again. All right, do you have any questions, either about your answer or about what was going on? So when we think about that, think about Lincoln's perspective and what are called the radicals, the radical Republicans, as in distinction from the normal Republicans, I guess. Lincoln would have been kind of run-of-the-mill Republicans, normal Republican. The radical Republicans were an extreme bunch, and see, I want to make sure I'm going to ask you a question that we have here. No. Okay, so what were the radical Republicans? What made them radical? That's what I wanted to ask. What made the radical Republicans radical, or why are they called radical? What did they want that was so radical? What was their purpose? Sally, what was their purpose?
I think that it was.
Everybody needs to talk louder. Maybe it's the air conditioning, but all your voices sound so soft, and I'm afraid it's not going to get picked up because we are recording this. Okay? Use your drama voice.
Okay. They held a grudge against the South, so they wanted it to be really difficult for them to kind of become states again because they didn't trust them and they didn't consider them to be worthy to be part of the Union again.
Yeah. So in a word, you could say they wanted revenge, right? They wanted to punish the South. Lincoln wanted to restore the South. The radical Republicans wanted to punish them.
Just said that the radicals viewed the South as a conquered enemy versus the Lincoln view as rebellious members. So he thought they were still part of it, but the South thought they were conquered.
Right, Lincoln, is that one of our questions?
No, that was in the first question.
Oh, okay. Wow, you were really complete in that. So Lincoln looked at the South as being kind of errant brothers who moved away from the family, the prodigal sons, welcome them back, do what you can to restore. But the radical Republicans said, no, they're a conquered enemy. We're going to make them pay. So that was a real difference between them. Of course, when Lincoln's assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes president, he is a Southerner, so he naturally has some affinity for the South. He also thinks that Lincoln's plan was a pretty good direction to head. And so he becomes really at odds with the radical Republicans. All right, let's go to the next question, and that is simply defining what is suffrage. Haley.
The right to vote.
Right. It simply means the right to vote. So I think before we've talked about women's suffrage, possibly, and here we're talking about suffrage for former slaves or for Black Americans, the right to vote. Question 3. Oh, by the way, question 1 was worth 2 points because you needed to talk about the 10% plan and then the Wade Davis bill. So 1 point for each part of that. 2 points to number 1. Number 2 is worth 1 point, of course. Number 3, how did Johnson test the Tenure of Office Act? Well, first of all, what was the Tenure of Office Act? What do you remember by that? What was it? Why was it enacted?
He couldn't remove any members, so like his cabinet.
Yeah, now remember, President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, has become president because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So the cabinet that Lincoln had becomes Johnson's cabinet. I mean, that's just the normal thing. You wouldn't expect him to just totally bring in a new cabinet because he wasn't elected to office. He's going to continue with that. But the problem is, one particular member of that cabinet was a very radical Republican and was causing a lot of trouble. Who was that? You remember? Yeah, and what position did he hold?
Secretary of War.
Yeah, Secretary of War Stanton. By the way, I don't know if you remember or not, but when I told you about what happened at the firing on Fort Sumter, I suggested that some think that it was actually Stanton who had sent what looked like warships to Fort Sumter, which maybe precipitated the Confederacy firing on him. He may have done that without Lincoln's knowledge. Lincoln may have known. But many historians wouldn't put it past Stanton to do something like that without getting an okay from Lincoln. That's the kind of person he was. And Lincoln, like Washington, had people on his cabinet that were opposed to him. Well, I guess we shouldn't say Washington didn't really have people on his cabinet opposed to him. He had people on his cabinet opposed to one another. Lincoln had people on his cabinet that actually opposed to him. They were undermining him. I think it was Lincoln that said, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That was kind of his philosophy. He felt like he had his enemies right there with him, that he could keep an eye on things. But anyway, so Johnson inherits this cabinet. And so and the radical Republicans know that the natural thing for Johnson to do would be to get rid of at least Stanton, if not others. And so they passed this law saying that he can't do that. All right, so how did Johnson test that tenure of office act? Hayden,
He dismissed his Secretary of War.
who was Edwin Stanton.
Yeah.
Yeah. And anybody, any question about that? So he dismissed Secretary of War Stanton. And then the second part of the question is, how did the radicals respond to this action? Brady?
They tried to impeach him.
Right. Well, actually, they did impeach him.
No.
They didn't just try to. They did. They used that action as the basis for impeachment.
Oh, so I took this as like, how did they react to it? And I said that the radicals were delighted because him like dismissing Stanton, it gave them a way to get rid of Johnson.
Yeah. Okay. That's the idea. All right. Now, are we confused about impeachment? Okay. Why did I say they didn't try to impeach him? They did impeach him. Alex?
Because he was impeached, but it doesn't like remove him until it's voted by what is it, Congress?
Senate.
Senate.
Yeah. 2/3 of the Senate have to vote for conviction. So to be impeached is simply to be accused. How many presidents then have been impeached in our history? Put your fingers up. Caleb, did you change your fingers? Oh, I could. One's hiding behind the other. Okay, everybody says 2. All right, who are they? Besides Johnson, who else?
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton is also impeached, right? But not removed. So it goes to the Senate. In the meantime, one of the things that Johnson does during this whole process, he has this problem with the radical Republicans who had taken over Congress. And what does he do? He's kind of a bullheaded guy, and it's not one that I guess is very conciliatory. And so he goes out on the trail campaigning, making speeches against the radical Republicans, and kind of acts like Trump. Only Trump gets away with it. Johnson didn't. It turned people away from him and turned them more towards the radical Republicans. So he kind of made things worse for himself. All right, so he is impeached. And what happened? As the Senate votes on it, do they convict him or not? No, they do not convict him. How close was it? What? 1 vote. 1 vote shy of the 2/3 needed. I read a story, and I'm not sure if it's totally true or not, about the last guy who voted. Now, I'm not sure if there was that much time, or whether, I think it was a matter of commitment. How are you voting? How are you voting? And he was the last person, I guess, to say how he was going to vote. And you can imagine the kind of pressure he had on him. Death threats, all kinds of things, in order to get him to vote for conviction. But he decided that the charges that were brought did not rise to the level of why a president should be removed from office, and so he voted not guilty. But it cost him politically, cost a number of people because they voted for acquittal. So then the next question you have to answer, number 4, why did 7 Republican senators vote for President Johnson's acquittal at his impeachment? I've given you a summary statement of that already, but Stephen, what do you have for that?
To follow their consciousness or conscience.
Well, it said it would bother their conscience?
No, to follow.
To follow their conscience, but why?
What is it? I don't know.
Why did their conscience tell them
Um,
to not vote for conviction? I think your answer has been incomplete. Alex?
I said they followed their conscience because they thought impeaching, like actually getting rid of him, would destroy the balance of power in the government.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Another possibility, Michaela?
I have that, if Johnson was convicted of leading radical, would become President Johnson, and it's because Johnson violated president.
Yes, so that would be another reason. You could, and you kind of alluded to this, but just the idea that a president shouldn't be removed just because they disagree with Congress. That's not a reason to remove a president from office. Michaela?
Well, for Stephen's answer in the book, I was confused about it too because it says 7 Republicans risked their political careers to follow their consciences
Uh-huh.
and joined 12 Democrats and voted for acquittal. Like that's what the book says. So I was also confused about that
Well,
because it doesn't mention the 7 Republicans anywhere else. in the
All right.
book until that.
well, I mean, the question says, why did they? I get, okay, you can say they follow their conscience, but does that really give us an answer?
Because you could tell that they obviously thought
I mean,
it was
would-
wrong.
would-
They had to
But
follow the conscience.
don't you want to know what their conscience told them?
No.
I feel like you could
Told
kind of
them
figure it
not
out,
to.
'cause, like,
Told them
I don't know.
that, yeah.
if they thought it was right, they wouldn't have voted him. So obviously they didn't think it was right.
If I asked one of you why you did something and you said I was following my conscience, you think it's going to end there?
Yes.
Why would you say yes?
sometimes you just gotta go with your gut.
Don't you think the next question would be, well, what's your conscience telling you? Why did you think that you should do that?
Because sometimes
I
it's just
feel
a
it.
feeling you have. It's
Yeah.
not like there's no
Sometimes
reason
it's
to
hard to
back
decide.
Well,
It's like-
the book does give you indications as to why they went that way. So, okay, the book says that they follow their conscience. That doesn't really answer the question, but will allow you that for purposes of points. But if you're asked that on a test, be advised that conscience is not the correct answer. There's something behind the conscience. The conscience does not act in a vacuum. They're just not sitting there saying, oh, I have a feeling that I should vote this way. No, it's based on their perception of what's going on. So it's not, contrary to what you said, your conscience is not just a feeling. There are things that are influencing that direction. Alex?
Was number 3 worth 2 points? Since there's like 2 different parts.
Yes. Number 3 is worth 2 points. All right, number 4 is worth 1 point. Number 5. What were the 3 important provisions of the 14th Amendment? What do you have, Megan?
They guaranteed blacks full citizenship.
All right, so the first thing, it gave blacks full citizenship, both in the United States and in their home states. So it wasn't just the United States citizen, and then the state could say, well, you're not a citizen here. No, it granted both places. That's an important part of it, although we'll take just what you said. All right, what's the second one? Give us the second one, Lahana.
It gave life, liberty, and property without it not being taken away.
There's something about that is particularly important. What about that? Not depriving a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What did the 14th Amendment? Where did the 14th Amendment apply that? That's the important part of this, because that's part of the Constitution. But where did they apply it, Devin?
We applied it to the states.
To the states. See, the Constitution, that's only applied to the federal government. But the 14th Amendment said, no, we're now applying that to the states. And that has a tremendous impact upon the balance between the federal government and state governments. in time to come, and particularly in the 20th century. As the federal government uses this to take more and more control over what is happening in the states. Remember, the Constitution says that whatever powers are not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. That left quite a bit of power for the states. But with this amendment, essentially, it's saying, states, you really don't have any power anymore. The federal government has the control. All right, and then what's the third item? Steph?
Needed the 10th Amendment, which reserves to states all powers not directly delegated to the national government.
That's an implication of the second point, which is that they applied to the states the Constitution provision that they could not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that's not a separate point. That's part of the second one. Lydia, what's your third?
I said that no, Confederate officers could serve unless there was 2/3 approval by the Senate.
Right. So former Confederate leaders could not hold office unless approved by 2/3 of the House and Senate. That's the third point. So 3 points on this. Any question? And for the second point, you really do need to have that they were applying that to the states. If you didn't have that part, you had the rest of it, take off half a point. But that's the really important part of that. Michaela?
I have a question about the first one because I completely misunderstood the question because I thought I was talking about what, it said how does Lincoln's 10% plan differ from the radicals' Wade Davis bill concerning the number of white males? I thought it was saying that the bills were concerning the numbers of white males, but the question was asking what the difference between the bills were.
Okay, I don't see how that's different. So what was your answer?
So I said Lincoln wanted to restore the South, but the radical Republicans wanted to revenge on the South. And you also said the South is still a part of the Union, but the Republicans said they had to reinstate it. Because I took it as what is the difference between the two bills that concern the white.
Oh, you didn't take into account the last part of the question.
No, I thought that was talking, describing the bills. Not what the actual question was.
All right, so you disregarded the last part of the question concerning the number of white males taking the oath of allegiance. Not sure why you disregarded that last part.
She said that she just read the question as how does Lincoln's 10% plan differ?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But then left out the last part of the
No,
question.
she thought that was describing the bills. She thought that was just because the bill supplement to
Yeah,
the question.
Oh, okay, I see what you were saying. Okay, with that understanding, all right. You guys can eke out the strangest interpretations of questions. There have been questions that I've done for 30 years, and no one ever understands it except the normal way. But you guys will find a way to understand the question that is so different, and yet, if you turn it around, it's
We all have,
understandable.
our brains work so interesting. We all have interesting
They
brains.
closed the blind, and so I couldn't read as well. So I was like,
All right, any other questions? All right, so I'm going to give you a point. There are only 9 here, but I'll make it a 10 point. So put the, I'll tell you what, I'll take, one more thing before we finish here. I want us to understand there's some things that you didn't have any questions over. And that is the other amendments. There were 3 amendments that were passed by the radical Republican Congress. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th amendments. And you need to know what those are. All right, so in a few words, how would you describe the 13th amendment? What did it do, Jessica? Right. So remember, how many or what slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation?
The ones in Confederate states?
Not even that.
Succeeding states.
Not even that.
Oh.
Where the states chose.
No, you've forgotten.
I mean,
Wherever there is still rebellion. In other words, anywhere where the Northern Army has not yet conquered. So even in Confederate states where the Northern Army had conquered, slaves were not free. It's only where they hadn't conquered yet. All right, didn't you guys get that before? So the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in areas where it had no power to free them. That's why essentially it didn't free anybody. So, even apart from that, and so it'd be parts of the Confederacy in which there were slaves that were freed and parts of the Confederacy in which they were not freed. Plus, you had the border states, which had slavery. And you even had some slaves in other states like New Jersey and other places like that. So what the 13th Amendment did was say, all right, we're going to have one standard for the whole country, no slavery anywhere. That's what freed the slaves, was the 13th Amendment. That's what people ought to celebrate instead of the Emancipation Proclamation. I guess you could say that was a step towards it, but it didn't really have the effect that people think it did. All right, so the 13th Amendment, and as you notice, these are called the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment we've talked about, so you know that, the three main points of that. And then the 15th Amendment, essentially what did that do? 15th Amendment, Jessica,
Every man regardless of race can vote.
say that louder.
Every man regardless of race can vote.
Right. So you can't keep people from voting just because of their race. So this is basically giving suffrage to black people, black men. It's still men at that time, it's not women. So black men can vote. All right, so make sure you keep those three amendments straight. Any questions? All right, your assignment for tomorrow is to use the outline on page 330 in your book to take notes in the next section, which is pages 336 to 341, Reconstruction in the South. And then complete the section review on page 341. Any questions?